Welcome back to 35,000 Watts, the podcast. My name is Michael Millard. I'm the director of 35,000 Watts, the story of college radio, a feature film about, you guessed it, college radio. Now available for download at 35000watts.com. With me today, my co-host, Lisa Gerard.
Hello.
And our resident music guru, Keith Porterfield.
Howdy. Thanks for having me back.
We want to know what makes a college radio band a college radio band. What are some of the common threads that we see in the music that came out of college radio? So one of the things you have to understand right off the bat is that college radio is its own thing. It's its own entity. It's very free-spirited, and that's what people love and loved about being in college radio. Students ran the station. They might have had a faculty advisor or mentor type adult person, maybe giving some guidance. But for the most part, most college radio stations are run by students. And those students turn over every year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And in that, you can have many different cycles of themes or theories or whatever you want to call it happening at these stations. So you've got student DJs, and those DJs are often music aficionados. And we all kind of played by our own rules and our own playbook, and we kind of made it up as we went. And that's part of that freedom that we had to explore. In that, there was no format at most stations. It was either the students bringing their own music to play, designing and creating and producing their own specialty shows. They might do a jazz show. I hosted an industrial show. You could do whatever kind of music theme you wanted to explore. Some stations were hybrid, so they might have a little bit of a format, like don't play anything that's played on commercial radio. Everything else is okay. Or it might have been completely structured. And yeah, you had a music list that you had to go off of that was created by the music director, like we did at KTXT from Keith when we were there. And sometimes there's flexibility in that too, where you could get a DJ's choice, or if you had a specialty show, you were responsible for filling that hour of music. And that wasn't necessarily going to be dictated to you from your music director. I think one of the biggest differences to keep in mind is that college radio is non-commercial radio. So it's the left of the dial. It's usually below the frequency of 90.1. And that was not advertised supported radio. So there were not commercials, and there weren't advertisers dictating to station managers what kind of music they thought would generate more ears. And so not being limited by advertisers' expectations in the business department and the marketing department, even to some degree, just left the door wide open for all sorts of music to come through those speakers over the airwaves. So with those doors being wide open for exploration, Keith, what can you tell us about your experience at KTXT as the music director and your relationship with, the music that we were playing at that time?
Yeah, I think the topic being what makes a college radio band a college radio band, the first thing that you have to really think about is that, especially in those days in 70s, 80s, and 90s of college radio, the music landscape was a lot different than it is right now. Nowadays, with social media and everything being what it is, if you're in a band, you can put up your own YouTube channel, and it sits right next to a YouTube channel of some gigantic band. And maybe you're not going to get as many views as these other guys are, but you're kind of competing on a sort of level playing field. You're at least in the same arena that they are. And that was a lot different experience than what a lot of bands had back in those earlier days, because if you weren't on a major label, there was no way you were getting on major radio, on regular radio, or getting your song played in that way. And so, while at KTXT we did play some major label stuff, especially bands that had kind of started out in the college arena and then kind of graduated out into major success, most of what we played were bands that were still looking for a big deal and didn't really have any other options for getting their music out there. And so, of course, what do? Well, the next best option is this massive network of smaller radio stations all over the country that is, obviously college radio. And so a lot of those smaller...
And with no format.
Yeah, exactly. And so, even less of a hurdle toward getting your music on the air. And so, a lot of those labels had their own representatives. A lot of the smaller labels would gather together and hire a company to be representative for them. And those reps would call radio stations. And as the music director at KTXT, I used to get, dozens of calls. I almost dreaded being in the office on some days because I couldn't get anything done because my phone rang just constantly with reps from smaller labels looking to try to push their bands. And so, there were levels of gatekeeping in there that kind of kept some bands from bubbling up farther than they did. Even to get to the college radio level was a pretty serious feat. You really had to work at it to pull that off.
Do you remember in the film, one of the bands talks about how they had to literally address their own envelopes and send their CDs and tapes to stations as well? I mean, it was like grassroots as grassroots gets.
Absolutely. And I would get calls, from all these reps, and so many of them. I had the ones that I knew I could trust that their stuff was going to be good. I had the ones that I knew their stuff was likely not going to be very good. And so with the limited time I had, I paid more attention to the things that were getting pushed by representatives that I knew well and that I could trust. And if you didn't have representation, if you just sent us a CD or a vinyl record cold, there was almost no chance that I was going to have enough time to review that. Because there was so much stuff. I used to get every day a full mail crate full of CDs and vinyl, and it's just impossible. You can't listen to all of it. And so, that was yet another kind of hurdle to jump over is, you had to get your stuff to college radio stations. And then on top of that, you had to make sure that somebody at that station was actually going to listen to it and give it a chance. And then on top of that, it had to be good enough to compete with all these other bands that were there. And so, even getting to that far, even getting to college radio was really difficult for a lot of these bands. And I got a lot of respect for the ones that really stuck with it and would continue to push new records out and would continue to have the reps call and browbeat me until I was going to put it on the air. Maybe not quite as a big a deal nowadays for bands that are just trying to get started out. Obviously everybody's looking for a venue to get your music out there. But there were just less avenues for it back in those days.
So, Michael, can you help us understand what's the common thread of the music that was played?
I think that's why this question interests me so much because, you have like country music is going to be on a country station, jazz music is going to be on a jazz station, pop music is going to be on a pop station. If you say, well, okay, college radio plays college radio music, that encompasses pop and jazz and rap and dance and rock and grunge and industrial. So you can't just say, oh, well, it's this type of music because we played every type of music. So then the question becomes what separates a band like R.E.M. or the Pixies or Sonic Youth, where you immediately think of them as indie alternative college radio bands, from a rock band like Aerosmith, say, who has never been thought of as a college radio band, but is essentially playing the same genre of music as, a Sonic Youth or a Pixies. I'm fascinated by that. I don't know if there's an answer to it. And I was actually thinking earlier, you have super poppy, hugely mainstream artists like, say, a Phil Collins, who would occasionally make kind of a weird, quirky track like In the Air Tonight, which I could see being a song. Like, imagine a world where The Cure records In the Air Tonight. That could kind of work, right? It's a quirky, atmospheric. You could see Robert Smith putting a twist on that. Conversely, The Cure had some really poppy, amazing, catchy songs, the type of which Phil Collins was known for knocking out of the park, like Left and Right, right? There's a crossover even there, but you're never going to confuse Phil Collins for The Cure. Is it the lyrics? Maybe to some degree, yeah. I think a lot of college radio bands, R.E.M. is a good example of that, where the lyrics are they're just deeper than what you're often going to hear, from a mainstream band. They're gonna reference things that make you have to go to a dictionary, or today you'd have to go to Wikipedia to look it up and be like, what the fuck were these guys even talking about, right?
I think Rage Against the Machine, I mean, their lyrics were completely, totally politically loaded, whether you directly heard them or interpreted it later. But we were playing Rage before they hit it big.
I'm also, by the way, just as a side note, fascinated by people who didn't understand Rage Against the Machine as a political band or understand that they had a viewpoint, because I'm not really sure how you would miss that, but there are people that did. But anyway, yeah. So lyrically, I do think, whether it be because of the lyrics being too political, too raunchy, too whatever.
Yeah.
Now you've got another avenue to get that music out, because college radio generally didn't have a problem with that. Musically, I would argue that across the wide spectrum of stuff that you would hear on college radio, musically it's more challenging. I think it's more likely to go past the kind of standard 3-chord pop. Although, certainly there are pop punk bands that made a career on just playing 3 chords, which is not a diss. I mean, that's not a judgment call about the type of music. It's just a fact of life that a Green Day will make it to the mainstream because it's accessible music. But, think of a band like Sonic Youth, say, where that's a challenge. Sometimes those albums could be challenging to listen to. Like, that's not always just pop it on and like have a light bop around the house kind of music. Like that's,
yeah.
And there are a lot of bands that we played that went a lot further than Sonic Youth in terms of like dissonance, in terms of really complex musical structures. That's kind of where I land on the discussion, I guess, is that there are factors at play with the music that was made that then ran some of those people up against the gatekeepers that Keith was talking about, and then find solace in college radio that you're talking about, Lisa, about there were no gatekeepers. There was no advertising
No
that
format,
you had to worry about. And I don't know that that's, the answer 100% of the time, but that I think is the answer a lot of the time, is either lyrically or musically or both. Those artists were too challenging to just catch the ear of the mainstream record label A&R rep, or catch the ear of the mainstream listener, and needed to find a different outlet.
A lot of commercial rock and radio, those people were buying songs. They were not really writing their own songs. Not all of them. There certainly were bands that were writing their own songs. In the college world and in the indie rock world, almost everybody is playing their own music. These people are into music not because they want to be huge singers, not because they want to have number one hits, but because they want to write songs and play those songs themselves. They don't want to write them for other people. They don't want to do other people's songs, although those bands do covers, obviously. And I think one of the things that is a theme through college radio bands is that these are all artists that are trying to get their own music out there, their own songs, the songs that they have written. And I think one thing, and I hate to say this because it almost sounds like I'm dissing a bunch of bands that I really like, one thing that does keep The Cure from being where Phil Collins is at and having them switch places or those kinds of things, or other bands. One that quickly comes to mind from the major rock world is Journey, because they had Steve Perry as their vocalist, who's quite possibly the greatest rock and roll vocalist of all time. A lot of these college and indie bands are not great singers. They don't have really great vocalists. If you're used to hearing Steve Perry all the time, and then you get Black Francis, shrieking about monkeys going to heaven, you're not necessarily climbing onto that second song, especially if you're really into the slickly produced, really professional vocal, So a lot of these bands, they're great bands. I love the Pixies. I could listen to Frank Black shriek all day long. But is it as, the same quality of vocal as Steve Perry, or even say like Sebastian Bach or somebody like that? Not really. And I think in a lot of cases, a band like The Cure, in order to have a hit like Friday I'm in Love, you're overcoming Robert Smith's vocal as much as you are leaning on it, And there are a lot of people, myself included, The Cure is my all-time favorite band. I love Smith's kind of cracked operatic vocal style. But again, if you're listening to top 40 radio, and back in those days you were used to hearing, say Whitney Houston on the radio, even a band like the Sundays that have got a great singer in Harriet Wheeler, her voice is, I could listen to her sing all day. She sounds like an angel, but she's not Whitney Houston. And, that's not Harriet Wheeler's fault. It's just Whitney Houston is one of the greatest singers that was ever alive, And so I think to a certain extent, and again, I hope it doesn't come off like I'm insulting some of my own favorite bands here, but I do think that could be a bit of an impediment to some of these bands, launching all the way up into major radio play and major stardom.
Michael, I'd like you to wax poetically about your favorite band, R.E.M., and why R.E.M. was such a college radio darling. I mean, they are the gold standard of a college radio sound. I
think it's safe to say that if you surveyed, enough people to get a decent sample, 50 people that knew college radio, and said, okay, name college radio band, R.E.M. is going to be in that conversation every time. It just absolutely across the board. It's interesting in the film 35,000 Watts, the story of college radio, available for download now at 35,000watts.com. In the film, we talked to Burtis Downs, who is the manager of R.E.M., and I actually asked him this exact question, and this quote is actually in the film. Maybe I'll play it right now.
To me, what separated them out made them more likely to be championed by college radio, made them like worth fighting for. I think just that they were really doing what they loved for the love of the game. They weren't doing it for commercial purposes. They weren't doing it to fit a format. They were just trying to make their art. They were trying to make their statement.
That was what Burtis thought really spoke to the kids that were in college radio, that they liked that. So beyond the music and the fact that R.E.M. has written dozens and dozens of great songs, unique yet accessible music, the other thing that college radio liked about them was that their attitude, who they were as people. It became obvious as they continued through their career that the kind of people they were and the kind of artists they wanted to be, and that really meshed very well with the idea of what college radio wanted to be. You know, independent, not beholden to anybody, not seeking some sort of higher plane of existence, but just wanting to be what they were and wanting to I love that they wanted to make their art. They wanted to make a statement. And I think everybody in college radio kind of is the same way. We all thought we were kind of making our own art by sharing other people's art, by bringing our own twist to our shows or whatever it was. And I think that extends to some of the other bands that get listed with them as quintessential college radio bands. I think the one that came up probably the second most was the Violent Femmes, in terms of,
oh yeah, great example.
As Karen put it in the film, and maybe we can share that clip right now.
The college radio phenomenon was in full effect when the Violent Femmes came around. That was, besides R.E.M., the Violent Femmes were the first band that really captured the hearts and minds of college radio.
Why can't I get just one kiss? Why can't I get just one kiss? There'd be some things that I wouldn't miss, but
how you do that, who knows? If there was a formula for that, everyone would have been doing it back then, but certain bands did. R.E.M. did, Violent Femmes did, Sonic Youth did, Pixies did, I would say Husker Du and Sugar, the Bob Mould bands did.
I think that's a common theme through a lot of these bands, is that they're not willing to make compromises. They're not willing to change what they want to do, the kind of songs they want to write. And there is an authenticity to that that I think plays well, or at least, at the time played well with us in college radio, not just at our station, but at other stations. So yeah, I definitely think that has a lot to do with it.
Going back to Violent Femmes, I think that's another great example of like the lyrics and how complex or out there they can be and they still hit. I mean, we all know that one song that uses that one word that everybody knows. Like that was never going to get played on commercial radio because, I mean, we were still FCC licensed, so we still had to follow some rules, but we got clever.
Those of us in college radio would have probably been more than happy to play a lot of stuff that we either didn't play or that we censored, and it wasn't because we were prudes. It was because, if for no other reason, we weren't going to be the one that got the FCC license yanked from the station, right? You did not want to be the DJ, or you certainly didn't want to be the station manager who was sitting in the station manager chair at the time where the FCC license got yanked from you. So there was rules that we had to follow.
Another thing we didn't touch on is like we were a place for regional and local bands to be featured as well. So we can go over that in future episodes, but that was another big part of what makes a college radio band a college radio band.
So yeah, that's a good point. We could probably do an entire other episode on that, but we talk about that in the film too, that local and regional bands of any genre were able to get a foothold by kind of, calling their local station up and being like, hey, we got a tape or we got a record or whatever.
Yeah, for KTXT in particular, without the Dallas music scene, we would have lost about 30% of our playlist. So that was very important to us back in those days.
This is a great late night sitting around drinking beer debate. If you're one of those people that likes to debate music, and I bet a lot of the people that are listening to this podcast are, we'd love to hear obviously what you have to think about it. So let us know through socials and whatnot. But what makes a college radio band or artist a college radio artist? Think about it. Thanks for listening. Remember, 35,000 Watts, the story of college radio, a feature documentary about college radio is available right now, 35000watts.com. Keith Porterfield, our resident music guru, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So go online, 35000watts.com, and share your feedback. Let us know what you think makes a college radio band a college radio band. You can also just let us know what you think of the podcast, what you think of the film, or if you have a fun story that you'd like us to share. You can also find us on all the socials, and we are always checking and posting on those as well. So if you want to comment there, that's great. We are on TikTok now, and of course, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Like we said at KTXT, let's keep it locked to the left, and we'll see you on the next episode of 35,000 Watts, the podcast.